I said, What do you think about squirting? And I remember she looked at me and said, Jessica, we barely even talk about men's sexuality. You think we talk about women's sexuality? No way. I don't even know what you're talking about. Welcome to Age Lust, a podcast where we share uninhibited stories about aging, desire, and wisdom. We focus on quality of life issues like sex, hormones, and the messiness of getting older and anything and everything you might consider TMI. I'm your host, Jessica Podonsky, a double board certified family nurse practitioner and menopause provider. I'm passionate about creating a community where we talk about embracing our gray hair, or even waxing it off down there, and how you're never too old to get an STI. And if you do, write me and we'll talk about it. While I am a medical professional, I am not your medical professional. Always consult with your healthcare team before making any changes. Welcome back to Age Lust. Today, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about who I am. Actually, I'm going to tell you what it's like to be a sex nurse. I'm not really a sex nurse. I'm not a nurse that has sex, but I have dedicated my career around understanding and getting the word out that sex, it is a quality of life issue. When my middle kid was in second grade, he actually told one of his teachers, I guess they were asking like, what does your parent do or something like that. And he actually said, my mom is a sex nurse. So I thought I'd talk about it. Like, what does that mean? And why is sex a quality of life issue? I'm going to go way, way, way back. So when I was a little kid, what you need to know about me is that I don't have a family with a medical background. I think my grandmother, who I never met, she was a nurse and like died on the floor, like cardiac issues. But my parents are artistic people and very creative people, and they were not medical at all. So I became a nurse after becoming a doula because I thought I wanted to be a midwife. And I think it's because when I was a little kid, I was so fascinated with two things: Miracle of Life, the Nova special, and Where Did I Come From, the book. I was so into that book that I used for my senior quote in high school. Sex is like jumping rope. It's fun, but you can't do it all day. And that's the thing. Sex is the reason that we're here. It's how we got here. And it is also the way that many of us express ourselves, whether you're on the spectrum of being asexual, which is a real thing, to somebody who's how society would define as hypersexual, or somebody who really embraces their sexual selves. So I want to tell you about how I became a sex nurse and what that meant and how I'm here and doing this and creating Age Lust. So Age Lust is about not just lust when we think about sex, it's about lust of living and that excitement that we get from expressing ourselves and taking risks and trying new things and sometimes being a beginner at something that we think we should be expert at, which can happen with sex as well. So, way back when, I think it was when I was in nursing school. No. I know it was when I was in nursing school. I remember watching this video that they were showing us on how to clean a colostomy bag. So, the deal with the video with a colostomy bag is when you have an operation and they take your intestines and they make an insert, your colon really, and they make an insertion into your skin and they pull out your colon so that just a little bit, so that the contents of your poop go into a colostomy bag and then you change that bag. So in nursing school, there was this video, and the woman in the video who was showing you how to clean your own colostomy bag, it was obviously a patient education video. She had this frizzy, bleach blonde hair and blue eyeshadow. It must have been done like in the 80s at some point. And she had these long nails with that dark maroon nail polish that was like very reminiscent of 1970s porn. And she's sitting there and she's talking about cleaning the colostomy bag. And then she takes her finger and she's gently circling this ostomy. It's called an ostomy, the actual area that's popping out, right? She's cleaning, like kind of massaging the ostomy. And I think she might have even stuck her finger in it for some reason, which is just kind of gross if you think about long nails. I'm not really into long nails. Like as a nurse, it's gross. Now, mind you, by the time I was in nursing school, I was already a parent of two people and had a lot of living in my life. And I thought to myself, this is a fucking porn. This shit is not like, this is a porn. So then, of course, I had to go and Google, like, is there ostomy porn? And there is. I didn't watch any. And you really, if you have an ostomy or know somebody with an ostomy, please do not fuck it. That led me to when I actually finally started working. And I started to notice that people were questioning their ability to be intimate with their partners based on certain things. It could be hip replacement. It could be ostomy. It could be back surgery. It could be their diabetes. I can't even tell you like the first time I started to talk to patients about sex and sexuality. But I remember having a conversation with, I guess, the chief resident of all of the urologists who were coming in. And I got really obsessed with this concept. And I started to do all of this deep research on squirting because, like, I worked at a major hospital and on my free time, I could do research. So I also still had my use of my nursing school research stuff. And I love learning. I really do. So I would, on my spare time, do research on things like squirting. Anyway, so I really wanted, because it just doesn't make sense to me, right? It did not make sense to me. What was squirting? Women ejaculating? Where was it coming from? There was no receptacle to hold excess fluid and the way that people were talking about squirting. Anyway, so I was talking to this chief doctor person who actually was also a urologist and also a woman. And I said, what do you think about squirting? And I remember she looked at me and said, Jessica, she went to Columbia for medical school. Now, again, this was like 2010, like probably around 2011, 2012, things really started to take off for me. But she looked at me and she was like, Jessica, we barely even talk about men's sexuality. You think we talk about women's sexuality? No way. I don't even know what you're talking about. We can talk about squirting another time. In fact, if you go to my website, if you go to Private Parts of Wellness or ageless.co, look for the blog, you can see a whole article on squirting that I wrote like years and years ago. And if you want to fight with me on it, you can. That's fine. But even Annie Sprinkle, the queen of squirting, and if you don't know who Annie Sprinkle is, like learn, talks about when she's recreating a fountain out of her vagina, she drinks liters and liters and liters and liters of water for like 24 hours. So that was me kind of also outing myself, saying, I'm going to talk about sex with patients. And what I realized is that so many people that talking about sex and sexuality needed to be part of people's recovery. It needed to be part of people's health journey. Now, not everyone's health journey, but lots of people. And especially when I'm talking about quality of life issues. So I'm going to give you an example of a patient. So I was transitioning at this one point after doing like bedside nursing, and I was transitioning to doing some discharge nursing as I was going to move into I was actually going to work in hospice, but I stayed on my unit and I was doing some discharge nursing. And the reason that I chose hospice at this particular hospital is because I started to look into sexual expression at the end of life and in palliative care. And at this one particular hospital that I was going to work at, that was one of the questions that they asked. Do you have any sexual health concerns that you want to discuss? Because even when we're at the end of our lives, there are some of us who want to express our sense of living through intimacy. And we're not talking about like a full on banging or anything like that's not what we're talking about. But intimate touch, and for some people it is sex. So back to the quality of life issue. So I was doing a discharge for this young person. This man was 31 years old and he had come into the hospital for a hypertensive crisis. What that means is that his blood pressure was like insanely high, very scary. And his sugar was also high. He was a type 1 diabetic. And one of the things, meaning what they used to call juvenile diabetes. So he was a kid who had it and now he was 31. And one of the things that happens when you live with chronic illness, especially as a child, and you get diagnosed, a lot of young people become fatigued with it. Anyway, so this 31-year-old came in with hypertensive crisis. So when you think about diabetes, and I don't want to get too like stuck in the weeds with this, but like when you think about diabetes, you have to know that cardiac issues happen too, blood vessel problems, right? And that's when people start losing limbs and neuropathy and all of that. So there's a lot going on when you have diabetes. So he really wasn't taking his medicine. He wasn't doing what he should, quotes, like bad word, should be doing because he was tired of doing it. He was 31. So I was talking to him and I was doing the discharge and I'm looking at him and he's a very handsome young man, right? He cared about his appearance. He was very handsome. Like his haircut was like spot on. And I looked at him while we were talking about the discharge and him taking his medicine and all of that stuff. Oh, I could have gone into the should have. But I said to him, are you dating? And he said, well, sometimes, not really. And I said, let me guess. You date until it starts to get sexual and then you're not having erections. And he was silent. He didn't say anything. And I talked about erectile dysfunction and diabetes and the heart. Obviously, he cared for himself. He went to the gym. He did all this stuff. And he wanted to be in partnership with somebody because we all want to be desired. And he would start dating. And then imagine being in your 20s and he literally cannot perform. He cannot get an erection. And how does he explain that? I have this chronic illness. I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. When we know, especially in our 20s, that like life is so hard in general. We talked about medicine and we talked about his erections and we talked about orgasm and we talked about him having partnership and that he actually did want to meet somebody and he did want to have sex. And instead of thinking about the shoulds, that by taking the medicine, perhaps his quality of life around sex and sexuality would improve. Now, I don't know how it turned out. And I don't know, if like I turned his life around or anything. I do know that I got him thinking. There was also the time, I could go on and on and on. Like the time where I was talking to a couple in Spanish on my day off about penile prosthetics, like having an implant into the penis, and how this person, also type 1 diabetic, I think he was like 41 or 42, and he'd already had two failed penile implants. And he was there with his girlfriend, who I do not think was his wife. But anyway, and we started to talk about skin and touch and his prostate, because his prostate was still functioning and his prostate was still like happening. And we talked about prostate stimulation and what that would mean for them as a couple, what that would mean for his understanding of being a masculine man. There are so many stories, like the guy who built the Verrazano Bridge. And this was the real kicker, right? Because he asked his team. He was very sick. He had lots of stuff going on, but he was going to recover. Lots of bags, and he was on contact precautions, which means that he was like, everyone had to come like gowned up to touch him. And his wife would come from Staten Island every day to upstate Manhattan every day. And he wanted to know if he was ever going to make love again. And he talked so much about how strong he used to be, and he built that bridge, and, and the doctors looked and they said, well, we don't know. The real answer is not, we don't know. A better response or a better question would be, what do you mean by making love? What do you mean by that? Do you mean, will you be able to pleasure her? Can she pleasure you? How do you like to be pleasured? But of course, that's really hard conversation to have in the way that our medical system is set up. That led to me getting really, really vocal about becoming the sex nurse in this hospital, and doing grand rounds and doing a presentation called It Matters. And that 86% at that time, I'd have to look at the statistics now, but at that time, 86% of patients, when asked, want to ask and talk about sex and sexuality, but they have to be asked. And about equal percentage of providers who are talking to these patients do not want to answer the question or don't want to be asked at all because they feel that they don't have the answer. From there, I started to talk to seniors. And I got to tell you, at that time in my life, like, you get into something because you really want to learn about it for yourself. So at the time that I started talking about sex and sexuality, I was hitting my 40s. Like, not then, but like I was in the middle of a very contentious divorce. You can listen to the whole thing on the divorce podcast if you want to hear the sordid, disgusting details. I was in a very rough divorce. I'd been told that nobody would ever want me. And I thought, wow, this is, rough. So I started to learn about aging and sex. Even in nursing school, one of the best lectures I had was when we did the gerontology portion. One of the best lectures we had was this nurse practitioner who came in, who is a gerontologist. And she said that pain and aging do not go together. If you are aging and in pain, something is wrong. And she also talked about the sex lives of older people, of elders. And they're young elderly, and then there's very old elderly. But she's talked about sex and sexuality being important. And that just sent me off. So I think it was planted, and that was in nursing school as well. So there was a lot in I probably just have a dirty fucking mind, honestly, but whatever. Move forward, I was in this divorce, and I noticed that the majority of people who were in the hospital were older. I got more involved in thinking about older people having sex. And so I started to do workshops around people over 60 having sex. And then I started to do a group that would meet once a month where we would come together and talk about sex. We had such a blast, and I learned so much. And back to the squirting, there was a couple that came, and this couple got together when they were in their 60s. The man had maybe never married in his life, and the woman talked about having sex for the first time at the age of 50. When she had had sex for the first time, she waited until her mother had died. She'd been in the position where she needed to take care for her mother her whole life. And so when her mother died, she finally was able to go and live her life. And she says when the first time that she had sex, it was so amazing. And that she pissed the bed. And she's like, I had never felt anything like that before. And my whole body was just shaking, convulsing. And I peed on the bed. And I was like, that's squirting. You squirted. So it all comes back. I did that for quite some time. And I did all of it for free. And that's not to say, ooh, whatever. I just loved being of service and talking to patients and to community members, because a lot of the people that were in these groups were not my patients directly. I was not their nurse. But I loved talking to these individuals, these older folks. But again, like there's such a stigma with aging and sexuality. You know, when I've talked about menopause in particular, I always go back to that skit with Amy Schumer in That Last Fuckable Day with Julia Louis-Dreyfus, who, you know, there all these comedy people are sitting around talking about, well, we're just toasting because this was her last fuckable day, and how we associate fertility with sexuality, or fertility with vitality, with sex and worth, really. So even getting into the menopause space and talking about that was rough, because I was very, very resistant. But now it's about, how do we stay vital? How do we find that age lust as we get older? Oh, I want to tell you this one story. So one time I was doing this presentation, I would bring condoms, lube, female condoms, male body condoms. So the internal, external condoms. I would bring sex toys, penis pump, things to like hand around, and people would just love them. And one person actually walked off with one of the vibrators. I would raffle some off. I mean, these were really well attended events. We talk about like hip pain. We would talk about the different ways to perform oral sex. If you've got back problems or mobility issues, different ways to have sex with mobility issues. Why the main reason that people get hip and knee replacement is for sex. Like that is the number one reason that especially women will get hip and knee replacement. But one time I was doing my presentation and I was going on, and I think this was like, maybe I was doing one specifically on body systems, because I would do a general one called It Matters. And then I would do one on body systems, where I would do one on kidneys, heart, and something else. I don't really remember. Maybe it was bones. I don't know. I would do just different presentations around sex and sexuality for older people. So I was doing this talk, and at the end of the talk, people always come up and they're like, sometimes they're shy and they're like, oh, can I take some condoms? I'm like, oh, a huge bowl. Take them all. That's great, you know. So this one guy comes up to me, and he was like 70 something, because he told me I'm 70 something. He said, I want to tell you, your talk was great. I loved it. And he goes, and I also want to tell you, I just made love for the last 12 hours and I can't even use my penis. And I was like, really? And he's like, I did it with these two fingers. And he shows me his index finger and his middle finger together, like a unit. And he said, I've reconnected with my old sweetheart. She's also 72. And it was like we were 16 again. And we just made love for the last 12 hours. And I thought, see, more people need to know that. We don't need to get caught up on what works and what doesn't work based on what society says is sex or sexual. Like, this person made it work. This couple made it work, and they had sex for 12 hours. God bless retirement, because I don't know if any of you are having sex for 12 hours. The thing is that, in fact, when we think about quality of life issues, I don't know how many people can sustain anything for 12 hours. But it is that erotic energy, that erotic charge that kept that energy going. And that's fucking amazing. And that's what I want as I get older. And that's what age lust is about. So, as a sex nurse, I have the privilege of talking to people on a daily basis about their sexual lives. I hope that I'm of service to remove stigma and shame at those encounters. And I also have the ability to work with people individually, kind of outside of my regular gig, to bring more of that feeling of possibility into their lives, whether it's through menopause or hormonal support. If you're a nurse and you're thinking that you want to talk about sex and sexuality, there are so many ways to do it with patients because they are so wanting to. And I'm not talking about like the pervy patients who have no boundaries, who are like, oh, you look good in those scrubs. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about patients who are really worried. I'm talking about the elderly patient or the older patient. They don't even have to be that elderly. The postmenopausal patient who is diabetic, their sugar's not under control. They have vaginal discomfort, vaginal itching, vaginal dryness. They have a partner and they say to you, we only have sex once a month. And we only have sex once a month and it's horrible, but I do it. And if you ask them, did you ever enjoy sex? They're like, yes, I did. It was great, but now it's too uncomfortable. It may seem to you that this has nothing to do with their lap chole, or meaning their like gallbladder, or their whatever they're in there for, if it's a medical issue. But it does, because there are ways that we can support these bodies. There are ways that we can take that pressure off and take the pain away so that they can feel connected to the people that they care for. They can feel connected to their bodies, and they can feel stronger and find other ways, additional ways to heal. And sometimes it's the thing that gets people to take their medicine, like that young guy all those years ago. So I just wanted to tell you what it's like for me as a sex nurse. I don't know how my career is going to change or grow. I want it to. And part of it changing and growing is creating my own space, as far as like the Meno Circle, for those people who are interested in working with me around hormonal questions and need community. So that's one thing. I don't know how it's going to change as far as working with other nurses. If you are a nurse, again, who is interested in talking about sex and sexuality and what that means, I'm going to urge you to get the People's Book of Human Sexuality, Expanding the Sexology Archive, edited by Bianca Laureano. I write a whole chapter in there called Chapter 6, The Erotic Power of the Professional Nurse and the Body They Move In. I'll read you just really quickly the first paragraph. I am a nurse. It is more than what I do. It is part of my identity. Whether it is signified by the clothing I wear, the tools I use, or the language I speak, my observations, actions, and reactions are informed by my nursing identity. This identification informs my intercourse with patients and personal relationships. Yes, I said intercourse. The more intimate the interaction, the more erotic, because we have left nothing behind in the exchange. Unlike a sexualized exchange, there isn't any seduction, no flirting, no provocation. Instead, it's my presence, the creation of a container for healing that is the erotic element in nursing. By acknowledging our whole selves as nurses, we realize that nursing as a profession is exactly that intimate, sacred, and in that interaction is where we move beyond skills and into the art of nursing. I go on, several pages. When I use the term erotic, this is for my nursing friends out there. When I use the term erotic, what I'm referring back to is Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic as power, where she talked about that sense of knowing. Like once you've touched that inner deep knowing, you can no longer turn back. But in the theory of nursing, to be the expert nurse, and I think that the world is just coming around to this because some doctors are finally saying it, to be an expert nurse is to just have an intuitive knowing. We can look at patients and be like, this person doesn't look good. This person, something's up. And all of the numbers may be looking perfect. But it's in that deep knowing that we care for our patients. If you're interested in the book, The People's Book of Human Sexuality, Expanding the Sexology Archives, put out by Routledge Press, I encourage you to get it. You can get it on that Smile site, if you know what I'm talking about. You can also get it directly from Routledge Press. I think there are always discounts on Routledge Press. I also have a podcast interview with Bianca Laureano that you can listen to, where we kind of go through chapter by chapter. In the back of this book, even though it's called, it's so funny because there's this chapter also called Sex Ed Happens by Francisco Ramirez, who I saw speak years ago. I don't know, because I started to go to all of these ASEX, like the American Association of Sexual Educators, Counselors, and Therapists meetings, and do research. And my thesis for grad school was on the erotic connection between erotic positive association with nipple stimulation prior to having your first baby as an indication of positive initiation of breastfeeding. Like, I'm really into this shit, this sex stuff. Francisco Ramirez writes and he doesn't know me, but he was really influential because he was like, look, I now work for the UN. I don't know if he's still working for the UN, but he was like, I work for the UN because I'm talking about sex. And at an ASEC, whatever. The point is that I love this stuff. I love talking about it. I love researching. I love learning more and more and more. And even in this menopause space, even in this hormone space, even in the aging space, I love learning more and how it just comes back to our erotic sense. Anyway, if you're interested in becoming a sex nurse, hit me up, send me a message. If you're not interested, but you just like what I'm doing here, do all the things, the likes, the follows. So this was a quick episode, but I hope you learned a little bit more about me and what I'm into exploring. Until next time. If this podcast is helping you, please subscribe, rate us 5 stars, and leave a review. You can write in with questions at hello@ageless.co, and I'll answer them on the podcast. If you want clarity on your aging journey, you can book a private session with me on my website, ageless.co. That's AGELUST.co. We're on all the podcast platforms as well as YouTube and Instagram. Links are in the show notes.